What is media literacy?
Big tough question right out of the gate.
That's a really big question.
Gosh.
Oh, God, wow. That's not an intimidating question at all.
It's big, eh? It's big.
I've wanted to make this video for a long time because there seems to be a general sense that people on the internet have terrible media literacy. It's like no one knows how to critically watch movies anymore and everyone is falling for fake news or thinking AI-generated images are real. Especially in the video essay space, I think a lot of frustration and drama and misunderstandings come down to poor media literacy, and I've seen my fair share of that as a content creator. But then I had an idea. If I could make the perfect media literacy video essay teaching people how to engage more critically and open-mindedly with the stuff they consume, maybe I could fix YouTube. So with this extremely achievable goal in mind, I got to work. Given my background as an ex-English teacher who taught media literacy skills in my classes, I honestly thought that it would be relatively easy to make a video about this stuff. But as I started digging into things, I quickly learned it's so much more complicated than that. I was completely unprepared for how difficult this video would be. So today, I want to bring you along with me on this journey. I'll talk about why media literacy is so complicated, what people get wrong about it, and what we can do to fix it. It's gonna be a big one, there's gonna be some twists and turns, so if you're ready, let's get into it. When I decided to make a video about media literacy, the first thing I needed to do was to understand what media literacy even means. And this is harder than it sounds because while we talk about media literacy a lot, people rarely stop to actually define it. In tweets and articles and even video essays, people use the term to mean kind of anything. It's sort of become a catch-all for literary analysis, critical thinking, fact-checking, reading comprehension, or just having the right opinion on a piece of media. So my first step was to establish what media literacy actually is, and to do that, I turned to academic articles and textbooks, because when in doubt, find experts and listen to them. But the thing is, the experts don't really seem to know what media literacy is either. I had such high hopes. I found all these great articles, I even got a couple of textbooks that are aimed at teachers and students. I mean, this book is for middle schoolers, how could it not be straightforward? But to be honest, I hated these articles and textbooks. I mean, they're not that bad, it's hard to explain how academic resources can both say so much and nothing at all at the same time. Like, listen to this. Media literacy is the ability to apply critical thinking skills to the messages, signs, and symbols transmitted through mass media. Or, we define media literacy as the ability to decode media messages, including the systems in which they exist, assess the influence of those messages on thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and create media thoughtfully and conscientiously. Or, critical media literacy is about asking questions. Through CML, we not only explore what we know, but also ask how we know it. When practicing CML, we employ a collection of skills that help us move from being passive consumers of media to becoming engaged critics and creators. What does that mean? Like, I know what all those words mean, and I understand what those definitions are getting at, but, like, what is critical thinking here? And what does it mean to decode the system in which something exists? And where do you even start with employing a collection of skills? A lot of organizations use some variation of the definition from the National Association of Media Literacy Education, which says that media literacy is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. Now, this is vague as hell, but in other places on the NAMLE site, they give a little more detail, saying that media literacy is the ability to encode and decode the symbols transmitted via media, and synthesize, analyze, and produce mediated messages. I understand that media literacy is a complex topic, but it seemed like every single definition I found was not only super vague and abstract, but also different from every other definition definition. And that's only accounting for people who actually gave definitions. Some of the sources I read didn't stop to define the term, they just assumed that the reader would be on the same page about what media literacy meant, which is a bold strategy when you're writing about such a complicated concept that doesn't seem to have any agreed upon definition. So why does all this research suck so bad at defining media literacy? Well, the good news is that other researchers are asking this same question. There's one article I read, Analysis of Definitions of Media Literacy, which, what a great title. And in this article, the author, W. James Potter, did a meta-analysis of other media literacy articles to figure out whether there's any widely agreed upon definition of the term. And what Potter found was that there are 434 different elements associated with media literacy across the hundreds of articles he read. Over 400 different skills or goals or outcomes that we associate with media literacy. To quote Potter, media literacy is regarded as being a conglomeration of a great many skills, including the ability to read, evaluate, analyze, imagine possibilities, deconstruct messages, recognize patterns, challenge meanings, judge credibility, decipher sender intent, counter-argue, dig for truth, avoid influence, and produce messages. And scholars claim that media literacy has the power to help us improve a wide range of other skills and abilities. It can also protect us from false messages in the media, create positive habits from scratch, and transform risky behaviors into positive actions. It can alter faulty beliefs about self, identity, health, community, religion, and media bias, while protecting our existing beliefs that are not faulty in some way. It can increase our degree of engagement with the media, other people, institutions, and society at large. So, yeah. Media literacy is complicated. And what's even worse about all this is that when you can't even agree on what something means, it's impossible to agree on the scope of the problems with that thing or how to solve those problems. So not only was I running into these frustratingly vague definitions, but all the solutions that writers posed for how to teach better media literacy were also frustratingly vague. So many of the sources I looked at boiled down to teach students how to recognize fake news or talk to your kids about social media algorithms. For instance, on the NAMLE website, that's such a difficult, series of letters to say. I'm not gonna call it NAML, though that's pretty good. Namely's not bad. For instance, on the NAMLE website, they suggest integrating real-world examples of media into lessons, providing opportunities for hands-on learning, and teaching students about responsible online behavior and information literacy. And on the one hand, yeah, that's all great. But when I was training to be a teacher, we were constantly told about the value of relating topics to students' lives, using real-life examples as much as possible, making lessons hands-on, and helping kids learn how to responsibly use the internet. And that was almost a decade ago. To me, all of these solutions from the NAMLE felt both glaringly obvious, yeah, we should teach media literacy skills in school, but also unsatisfying. I refuse to believe that the way to fix people's poor media literacy is just pay more attention in English class. So the scholarly research had provided more problems than solutions, and at this point, I felt like I had wasted 3 weeks of my life getting nowhere on this project. So I did what we all do when we've reached rock bottom. I went to Twitter. Part of this was because the scholarly stuff hadn't gotten me anywhere, but it was also because I was curious about another angle of this media literacy discussion. Whenever I had read about media literacy in an academic context, it was almost always focused on teaching students how to analyze nonfiction. Students were media literate when they could identify fake news or tell the difference between a news article and an advertisement. But colloquially, when most people use the term on the internet, it was more often applied to fiction. People are media literate when they can analyze TV shows or understand the themes of a movie. The difference between how academics and lay people use the term media literacy wasn't intended to be one of the main focuses of this video. It was just something that I was mildly curious about. But especially after having learned that even media literacy researchers can use the term wildly different from one another, I was interested in how this would be reflected in how the general public used the term. But, probably unsurprisingly, Twitter didn't make anything clearer. When you search media literacy, you mostly just get people quote tweeting someone's opinion on a TV show and saying media literacy is dead. Believe it or not, there aren't in-depth Socratic dialogues happening on this godforsaken website. But there was something that surprised me during my Twitter excursion. Apparently, talking about media literacy is cringe. Now, maybe I'm too English teacher pilled to understand this, but I find it genuinely weird. That's like saying you think critical thinking is bad, actually, right? According to Twitter, people who care about media literacy are dweeby little nerds who don't want anyone to have any fun, and they just police people's interpretations of media. Media literacy enjoyers are pretentious woke scolds who want to overanalyze everything, when in reality, it's not that deep, bro. So, yet again, I had run into yet another hurdle that made this topic even more complicated than it was at the start. And I felt like the more I read about media literacy, the more I realized just how complicated it is, the more resentful I got about it. The past couple of weeks had been really difficult. I'd had this video idea that I thought would be, if not simple, at least straightforward. But then I started to look into it and I found that no one could agree on what the term media literacy even meant, let alone agree on how we could fix things. And even when people offered solutions, they were unsatisfying. Honestly, it's no wonder there's backlash against the very concept of media literacy. No wonder everyone thinks it's cringe. It's a nebulous concept at best with a squishy, ever-changing definition, and because it has so many other concepts packed into it, it's nigh impossible to pin down and thus also impossible to teach. So whenever people talk about it, any solution they offer is so basic it feels obvious, and audiences end up feeling condescended to. It's messy, it's complicated, it's frustrating, and it's still something I wanted to make a video about. But clearly my usual method of research wasn't getting me anywhere, so I did what all great academics do when they're frustrated out of their minds about what they're studying. I made it everyone else's problem too. I hit up 12 of my friends and asked them to sit down and chat with me about media literacy, and honestly, they added a lot more complications, but their insights did help me to work through the absolute mess that is media literacy. So let's see what they had to say.
Hi, you may not know me, but my name is Babilla. I'm a video essayist and friend of Zoe, most importantly.
My name is Ben. I run the YouTube channel Dummy.
I'm Elliot. I am a YouTuber.
Hi, my name is Emily, otherwise known as Lady Emily on the internet, from the YouTube channel Lady Emily, and is also co-writer for the channel Sarah Zed.
My name is Jose. I run a channel that is also named Jose.
Well, I'm Legal Kimchi. I am a video essayist here on YouTube.
I am Lily Alexander. I make video essays about art and gender and the tech industry.
Hello, I'm Lola Sebastian. I have a YouTube channel where I talk about primarily literary adaptations.
My name is Nick Covington. I'm the current creative director at Human Restoration Project.
I'm Noah Sampson. I make YouTube videos. I do commentary videos.
Yeah, my name is Scott Nicewander. I have a YouTube channel called NerdSync.
My name is Star. I'm an anime girl on the internet. I am a comic artist and YouTuber. I've been making comics and stories on the internet for basically as long as the internet has allowed you to do such a thing.
The first thing I wanted to do with these interviews was to see if I could crowdsource a definition of media literacy. And when I asked everyone how they defined media literacy, I got a really interesting variety of answers, mostly having to do with looking under the surface of a piece of media, getting something more than just the basic plot, whether or not that deeper meaning was intended by the author.
Media literacy, it comes in a lot of different shapes and forms, right? So when I think of someone who's media literate, it's someone who's engaging with a piece of media at a level that goes beyond passively consuming it. They're actively thinking about what they're seeing, what it means, and often placing it in a greater context.
Media literacy is understanding what the message, what the point of something, or at least at the very least trying to uncover that and not necessarily taking everything as face value, I suppose.
So I think media literacy in general is your ability to properly like read into those things, like to be able to see like what somebody is trying to communicate, whether it be intentional or not intentional.
Media literacy is the ability to apply like a variety of different ways of viewing media, the ability to understand a thing on its own terms and consider like the context that it was made in.
All of these answers were so great. I was genuinely so impressed by every single person I talked to. But there were some particularly interesting tidbits that I want to look at. So, remember some of the definitions from media literacy folks I brought up earlier? One of the things that almost all of them included was the idea that media literacy isn't just about how we consume media, but also the skills we employ when creating it. But even though all the people I interviewed are content creators, only 2 of them considered that creation element in their definitions. Nick, who's a teacher, and Ben, who studied media literacy and works in media.
But I think media literacy today looks like being a critical consumer of media, considering purposes, intentions, but then also in the creation space too. So creating media and information for authentic audiences.
I would say that media literacy, expanding on that, is something like the ability to find and understand and maybe even create media in order to participate in society.
I found it fascinating that everyone else focused on media literacy skills from the viewer side of things rather than the creator side of things. But honestly, I think most of us think of it this way too, right? Media literacy is something you do when you're consuming media. It's a skill for readers. Writing skills are something totally different. Right? I'll get into that in more depth later on, but for now, I also want to touch on another really interesting bit that Scott from NerdSync brought up. He said that being media literate means knowing the difference between plot and story.
It's really easy to confuse the idea of plot versus story, whereas like the plot is the stuff that happens, like it's the list of things that happens, but what's like the story that the author is trying to tell through those things that happen. And so I think for me, it's trying to find that story, whether it's intended by the author or just something that I picked up through my reading or watching.
A couple weeks after I did those interviews, I actually sent Scott a DM to tell him how integral this idea he'd brought up was to my video. He was super nice about it, but admitted that he'd actually gotten it from a book, Wired for Story by Lisa Kron. I told him that I was totally fine just pretending like he came up with it on his own for the video, so everyone be sure to leave a comment talking about how cool and smart Scott is. But I did actually look into the book just to get some further context. And you know what's super interesting? This isn't a book about how to be a better reader. It's a book about how to be a better writer. So not only was plot versus story a really interesting framework on its own, but it also fit perfectly with the idea that media literacy is about both creating and consuming media. Plot versus story also connected really well with something both Star and Lady Emily mentioned.
When it comes to art specifically, people viewing art, movies, books, games, whatever, as a form of like plot delivery or just basic idea delivery rather than what is it trying to say? What is it trying to do?
That's on the surface level of they understand what is going on in the plot, even if not every single thing is directly spoon-fed to them. And also just kind of understanding the intent. Why is this being shown to us? Why is this important? And kind of gleaning additional information from that. And I feel like most people have a good grasp of the former, but the latter I feel like is where a lot of people sometimes struggle, and then that's where it causes problems occasionally.
The other thing I really like about the plot versus story framework is that it can be applied to all kinds of media literacy, not just fiction. Like if you're reading a news article, you have the plot, which is the literal words on the page, the factual information that the journalist wrote, But you also have the story, which is the rhetorical purpose of the article, what the journalist is trying to get you to feel or do, along with all of the other context, like where and when it was published. This actually solved some of the issues I had with the academic research on media literacy. Earlier, I mentioned that it seemed like when academics talk about media literacy, they were usually referring to how people engage with nonfiction, like news. But when the general public talks about it, they're usually talking about how people engage with fiction, like movies and books. It always felt like there was some fundamental difference between what each of those groups meant when they used the term. But now I realize that no, media literacy is both of those things. Though all that being said, even after these interviews, I still hadn't found a perfect definition of media literacy. I was starting to get a better idea of what it meant, though, and I realized that maybe its elusiveness as a concept is actually part of it. Media literacy is all the things my interviewees said, and all the things the research articles said too. It is a whole bunch of skills like looking under the surface, asking questions about how and why things are made, thinking about the contexts in which things are made, and using those skills on both fiction and nonfiction, both as a consumer and a creator. Media literacy is complicated, and maybe the fact that it's so complicated is part of why people struggle with it so much. But now that I knew that, now that I knew just how messy this topic was, I could start to actually confront the problem. I could start to solve the media literacy crisis. Except, when I asked my guests about this crisis, a lot of them didn't think it existed. The consensus actually seemed to be that people have always been bad at being critical consumers. It's just that now, thanks to the internet, we're all a lot more aware of the problem than we used to be.
Yes, there is a crisis. However, I think it's perpetual. I think there's always been a crisis. There probably always will, because you cannot be an expert in everything at all times.
I would say that like a lack of like deeper thinking and understanding has probably existed for a long time. I guess maybe the reason why people these days are like, it's a crisis is because we have access to so many things now and so much knowledge now. But part of me feels like some level of this has like existed for forever.
I don't know if I would call it a crisis. I feel as though there's always been bad media analysis out there, and social media has just made it more common.
Honestly, it seemed like at every single turn, this video was just getting more and more complicated. I had just gotten a handle on what media literacy meant, and then as soon as I tried to move on to solving the problem, now suddenly I had to consider that maybe there wasn't even a problem to solve in the first place. Was it even worth making a video about media literacy if there's not a crisis? Well, there's good news, and there's bad news. The good news is that there may not be a media literacy crisis. The bad news is that there still is a crisis happening.
That's the overview of my view on media literacy right now. I think it's symptomatic as opposed to the source of the problem. I don't think the singular focus on it addresses the problem that we observe when we say media literacy crisis.
I do not think that there is a media literacy crisis. I think the crisis is imperialism and capitalism, and it has been this way forever. I think it's part of a constantly morphing crisis, which is our state of affairs, our systems.
There wasn't some kind of perfectly ideal media literate past that we've fallen from over the past couple of decades, but clearly there is something wrong, right? Reddit has countless threads about how Walter White was a hero and Thanos was morally correct. Facebook is full of people who can't tell the difference between a real photograph and whatever this is. Every single content creator I know has gotten comments from people who are mad about something they didn't even say in their video. I've personally experienced several instances of people asking questions that they could find the answer to if they just took a single second to look at the description. Something is wrong. We all feel it, we all see it. So what is happening? If media literacy is about asking questions about the media you're consuming or creating, then bad media literacy is when you don't do that. So, what is stopping people from doing that? Well, there's quite a few potential answers. It's possible that people are just lazier or less intelligent than we used to be, but I think that's a deeply uncurious answer to this problem, because people don't exist in a vacuum, and we're all products of our environments and the systems we're living within. Insert coconut tree joke here. So instead of blaming individuals, let's take a look at this environment and all these systems and see if they have any answers for us. While I was thinking through all of this, the most obvious answer to me was that people aren't asking questions about their media because asking questions takes time. And like I talked about in my video on efficiency, a lot of our systems prioritize speed and immediacy at all costs. This was actually something a couple of people brought up during our interviews.
I think media literacy is having the ability to interpret the information that you are consuming in a rational manner. And now with social media and technology, that all that really means is just not having the instantaneous reaction that these systems and platforms are designed to make you have, to like or to share or to quote tweet and talk shit or whatever.
They're going to be like, oh, I have to get in the comments and react to this immediately, because that is sort of what the internet culture is I have to have an opinion, I have to have a reaction very quickly rather than sitting with it and thinking about it. So it almost is sort of like, I wonder if the YouTube comments in general is part of potentially a problem of everyone being like, oh, I want to be the first to comment this. I have to have an opinion, a reaction so quickly, rather than just like, that was interesting. Let me sit with this a little bit. So for me, with stuff like Velma, it was important to me to get in front of it and be like, let's not be too hasty. Here is stuff to get excited for, and trying to be open-minded about it. Because if I don't have an immediate reaction, the people who will are the people who are going to say horrible, bigoted things. I mean, they're going to say it regardless. It is hard because I wish I could take the time and marinate in it and sort of be like, here are my full thoughts. But because the people I don't like are going to say their thoughts immediately, it does sort of pressure me to be like, well, I have to get my thoughts out really quick, because I don't want them to be the only voices out there that people are listening to.
In other words, social media and the internet more generally incentivizes immediate reactions. This is clear in some obvious ways, like how you're rewarded when you post about a trending topic because algorithms favor relevance and recency. But there are also some features of social media that we don't really stop to think about that also play into this. Like how you're able to comment on a YouTube video you haven't watched, or share a link on Facebook to an article you haven't read. One of the reasons for this is that a lot of our media is focused on making things as easy as possible for consumers. Restricting your ability to immediately comment with whatever gut reaction something made you feel would be frustrating, and people might feel like they were being censored. On top of this, the algorithms used by YouTube and Amazon provide hyper-individualized recommendations, so you don't have to waste time looking for what you want. Everything is made to be easy, straightforward, and uncomplicated. And this is true for our art, too. Generally speaking, at a societal level, we like easy stuff. We like the easy melodrama of soap operas and CW shows. We like the self-indulgent fan service in Marvel and Star Wars. We like the simple, familiar 3-act hero's journey. But while we like all those things, they don't prompt us to ask questions. They don't surprise us, they don't take risks. They're designed to be easy. It's the media equivalent of junk food. We love to doom scroll and binge watch and not have to think too hard about what we're consuming, just like we love to eat fatty, salty foods that are convenient and easy, if not nutritionally dense. Sure, it hits all those short-term pleasure receptors in our brains, but at what cost? And just to be clear, I'm not trying to media shame or food shame anyone. All of these things are enjoyable, and that's okay. I like salt and vinegar potato chips, and I like watching compilations of baby animals. I spend a not insignificant amount of time watching videos of animals. My friends know this about me. They will send me videos of small animals multiple times a week. Shout out to my friends. Anyway, this difference between easy media and more cognitively engaging media is outlined really well by Steven Johnson in his book, Everything Bad is Good for You. Now, just as a disclaimer, this book is about pop culture, but it came out in 2006, so some of the references are a little dated, but I still think it has some really interesting insights. Like, for instance, Johnson suggests that one of the differences between shows that are more or less cognitively rigorous is about how much information they give the viewer. The open question posed by these sequences in more rigorous media is not how will this turn out in the end, the question is what's happening right now. Sorkin's shows, like The West Wing, are the narrative equivalent of fog machines. You're supposed to be in the dark. You're supposed to be confused. He goes on to argue that when media holds back information and requires more engagement from the viewer, not only is that good for us, but it's also more enjoyable. Part of the pleasure in these modern television narratives comes from the cognitive labor you're forced to do filling in the details. But if that's the case, then what does the industry have to gain from making stuff that requires such little media literacy? Well, when we've become so used to media that gives us easy answers, whenever a film doesn't show every single detail of the world or story or character relationships, people get mad at things that aren't explained. And so media that tries to give audiences that pleasure of cognitive labor is often punished at the box office or torn apart on Twitter for being confusing or having plot holes. I'm just gonna say it. We don't need prequels and origin stories for every single character in a major franchise. We don't need an extended universe that fills in world-building gaps for us. We should be able to do that work on our own. We should want to do that work on our own. Because just like how movie monsters are scarier the less we see of them, fictional worlds are more magical the less the author stops to explain every single detail about them. But it also comes down to risk. When media is easier to consume, there's a lower barrier to entry and less danger of misinterpretation or misunderstanding. It might not be high art, but it's inoffensive, so it can appeal to a wider audience. And wide appeal is really attractive to people who are in the business of art. This is why it's such a huge deal when more intellectually challenging media does well commercially. When Everything Everywhere All at Once came out, I don't think anyone was expecting such a weird movie to do so well with general audiences. But even still, it did run into some issues with misinterpretations and misunderstandings. For instance, when my husband and I saw it in theaters, there was a group of women behind us, probably like college age, a couple years younger than us at the time. And when the movie ended, he and I were just sat there like emotionally processing what we just watched. And one of the women behind us turned to her friend and said, "So do you think they're gonna make a sequel to explain what happened?" And I think about that at least once a week. During my discussion with Lily, she brought up a really interesting point related to how we could solve this issue, though.
Patrick H. Willems, he was talking about, I think it was in his video, What's Next After Marvel, basically the need for movies that train people to watch movies again. For movies that get people like eased back into ambiguity or like plot lightness. And I feel like Challengers was one he cited there. I am a huge fan. I loved it. And I think that is one that it's extremely accessible, but it's also weird. And like watching that movie and also seeing that movie be a big success made me feel hopeful, you know, for like movies that can come along and bridge the gap and get us making like movies for grown-ups again.
I really like this, but I also think that we shouldn't necessarily assume that even the most straightforward training wheel movies are immune from poor media literacy. Because, for example, this is such an embarrassing story. So, you know in The Dark Knight, the refrain, "You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain"? It took me probably like 8 years and like half a dozen viewings before I understood that that is literally Harvey Dent's character arc in the film. And they just say it. Like, they just say it out loud several times. Like, it's not subtext, it's text. And I have a graduate degree in English. I have pretty good media literacy, I think. And I think about that a lot. I remember when I realized it. I remember when I realized what they had meant, and it was this, like, I literally was sitting on the couch and, like, gasped. I was like, holy shit. Oh! Please like and subscribe. We need to be a little patient with ourselves. Anyway, all of that is to say that sometimes people won't be able to pick up on even the most obvious of themes. But another part of the issue with the entertainment industry is that, just like how social media tries to quantify human interaction, studios are trying to quantify art. This was actually something that Jose brought up during our discussion, so I'll let him explain it.
I get annoyed when people try to build this idea of consensus around movies. We all have to like or dislike something as an objective fact. But we sort of see these people who are so insistent that their opinions about a piece of media are the right ones, that they've tried to sort of fashion this idea of objective criticism. They're so obsessed with Rotten Tomatoes scores and stuff like that. And they're trying to sort of formulate some kind of objective measure of quality for a piece of media, which is incredibly silly and ridiculous. They're not just coming at it like as one opinion of many. They are getting closer to the objective truth. That's, I think, why they get into like downvotes on YouTube videos, like that means anything.
For a lot of people with poor media literacy, numbers are a really easy metric for understanding media. Why would you worry about actually analyzing a film to understand its strengths and weaknesses when you could just look at its Rotten Tomatoes score instead? And on the industry side, making art objective and quantifiable makes it easier to figure out the most efficient method of dispensing that art, as we've seen with the rise of binge watching thanks to streaming services. And we're not just seeing this with movies either. There's been a recent rise in book summary apps, and I find that absolutely fascinating. Now, obviously, things like CliffsNotes have been around forever, but now we have short-form, Blinkist, and Magibook, which aren't helpful guides to books. They're literally just summaries of books. And something that all of these services emphasize is how easy they're making things. They take confusing ideas and explain them in plain and simple ways. Never get confused by a complicated book again. I don't know if you've seen these ads for Magibook, but they are wild. There's a couple of videos that I've seen from folks breaking down exactly what they do and how terrible it is, so I won't get too much into it here, but suffice it to say, making something simpler doesn't necessarily make it better. But if you see books not as art that's made with intention, but instead as a quantifiable and infinitely reducible data point of which you need to sell as many units as possible, then of course it makes sense to reduce it down until it's as easy as possible to consume. But this focus on ease of use is also a big factor in another media literacy issue, the spread of misinformation online. Part of this is because, as Mike Caulfield puts it, the primary use of misinformation is not to change the beliefs of other people at all. Instead, the vast majority of misinformation is offered as a service for people to maintain their beliefs in face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In other words, it's confirmation bias. Social media actually thrives on confirmation bias, because while changing your beliefs is hard, maintaining them, having them catered to, being told what you want to hear, is easy. And like I've said over and over again, brains like easy. So social media companies aren't incentivized to combat these algorithms, and instead just focus on giving users what they want. And that's to say nothing of how much YouTube and Facebook actually directly profit off of grifters. But just because these systems aren't incentivized to change doesn't mean that we're stuck like this. Now, unfortunately, a lot of solutions for these big picture problems are unsatisfying. Like I mentioned earlier, most articles and organizations focus on education as a panacea to media literacy issues, and I think that's just a lazy answer. One of the books I read for this video is a nonfiction graphic novel, A Fire Hose of Falsehood: The Story of Disinformation. And I think that it can be a really valuable resource. Like, it has some really interesting stuff on the history of propaganda, but this whole book talks about the fire hose, the big institutional forces that overload us with information. And its solution to that issue? Wear a raincoat. So, first of all, that metaphor really falls apart because the danger of a fire hose isn't the water, it's the pressure. Sure, wearing a raincoat will probably keep your clothes from getting wet, but it's still gonna hurt. And second of all, like I said earlier, I'm skeptical of any solution that comes down to just teach more media literacy in school. When you have such powerful forces bombarding you with information and misinformation and disinformation, it doesn't really seem fair to put the responsibility entirely on the individual. Rather than trying to protect yourself from the fire hose, doesn't it make more sense to just turn the hose off? Now, to be fair to this book, the authors do offer other suggestions for how to protect societies from the proverbial fire hose of falsehood. They bring up regulations on businesses, especially social media, as well as safeguarding free press and repairing the public sphere. And these are solutions that have been echoed by other media literacy scholars like Dana Boyd in her article, Did Media Literacy Backfire? Now, I don't love every single thing she says in this article, but there are some gems that I think are really helpful for understanding the scope of our society-wide media literacy struggle. She argues that media literacy programs and solutions that focus on expert fact-checking and labeling are likely to fail. Not because they are bad ideas, but because they fail to take into consideration the cultural context of information consumption that we've created over the last 30 years. Addressing so-called fake news is going to require a lot more than labeling. It's going to require a cultural change about how we make sense of information, whom we trust, and how we understand our own role in grappling with information. In other words, we've built this huge, tangled attention economy web, and there's so much baggage associated with it, like all the algorithm stuff I brought up at the beginning of this section, that surface-level issues like labeling misinformation aren't ever going to be enough. What we need to do is untangle the web. The question of how we untangle the web is complicated. Some people, like Ben and Elliot, argue that we need big-picture, radical societal change.
For one, to just start radically changing systems of education, systems of media, just sort of radically undermine capital. You know, the more that you undermine capital and put power into the hands of workers and in the hands of non-proletarian working class people, in the hands of people who are underprivileged, in the hands of people who are disabled, the more that you do that, the less you'll feel there's a problem with media literacy.
But until the revolution happens, Dana Boyd suggests in her article that we instead get creative and build the social infrastructure necessary for people to meaningfully and substantively engage across existing structural lines. This won't be easy or quick, but if we want to address issues like propaganda, hate speech, fake news, and biased content, we need to focus on the underlying issues at play. No simple band-aid will work. Part of the problem with this, though, is that there's been an erosion of trust in a lot of the institutions that make up this social infrastructure. For instance, people are becoming more skeptical of higher education, but especially of the humanities. And the humanities are the home of media literacy studies.
Actual humanities education of like thinking and reading and writing is on the decline on the average in our society because we don't like assign a value to it really.
I would situate this in the context of a growing resentment for like humanities and liberal arts in general. You know, I get the feeling that people don't understand or can't quantify the benefit that those sort of like disciplines give. And like universities all over the world are slashing humanities funding to make room for more like STEM funding.
I'm not saying that these solutions are doomed to fail. I actually have a lot of hope for these kinds of things. I'm fatally optimistic about this kind of stuff, but like Boyd said, this won't be easy or quick. So until we actually can turn off that fire hose of falsehood and stop our systems from incentivizing poor media literacy, there has to be something we can do in the meantime, right? If we don't have the power to turn off the fire hose, we should at least put on a raincoat. Now, I know that I've just spent the past however many minutes arguing that the problem is systems, and that is true. I know that there is no individual solution that is a perfect panacea for any of the big picture issues I talked about. I know that. But just because certain behaviors are incentivized, that doesn't mean that we should just roll over and give up. There are ways that we as individuals can practice better media habits, including by using the sponsor of today's video, Milanote. Milanote is a tool for organizing creative projects, and it essentially functions as a virtual whiteboard. I'm a really visual person, so whenever I'm working through an especially difficult application, for those of you that Zoe B, which is also in the description and on the pinned comment, actually came in clutch for this video with how much it helped me to organize the mess. Social media had us to speed up, to be more efficient, to consume as much content as possible. But the good news is that once you're aware of these forces, you can start to work against them. For instance, you can take steps to make sure you're not just consuming short-form media. Stephen Johnson might not have had any idea of what the internet would become in 2006 when he was writing Everything Bad is Good for You, but in it, he argued that the internet possesses a different kind of intelligence from the intelligence delivered by reading a sustained argument for 200 pages. You can convey attitudes and connections in the online world with ease. You can brainstorm with 20 strangers in a way that would have been unthinkable just 10, now 30 years ago. But it is harder to transmit a fully fledged worldview. The cognitive immersion of a novel requires a physical immersion for the effect to work. You have to commit to the book, spend long periods of time devoted to it. If you only read in short bites, the effect fades, like a moving image dissolving into a sequence of frozen pictures. I know books are slow and tedious, but that's a feature, not a bug. Short-form media is fine, but long-form media is also important, especially for nuanced topics. The most important piece of advice when slowing the f down, though, comes down to one single concept. Media, all media, is made with intention. As a writer and a poet, I can assure you that every single word a writer chooses is chosen for a reason. So whenever you feel a strong emotional reaction towards something, pause before you comment on it or share it. Use that pause to ask yourself questions about what you just saw. Media is made with intention, so what kind of intentions might have been put into this? What do you think the author is trying to do with this thing they made? Who do you think they made it for? And once you've asked yourself those questions, then you can decide if what you're feeling is fair or not, and then you can decide on how you want to proceed with sharing it or leaving a comment. This is especially true if what you're reading is challenging you, either intellectually or ethically. Like I talked about in the last section, our brains really don't like to be challenged, and a lot of things in our environment have taken advantage of that. And now a big chunk of our media diet is made up of easy, unchallenging stuff. So when you're faced with something that does challenge you, whether it's because the writing is difficult, or because it approaches its themes in an ethically ambiguous way, or because it's just clearly coming at a topic from an opinion that is radically different from yours, it can be off-putting at first. It's frustrating when things don't give easy, comfortable answers. And it's okay if your gut reaction to something like that is frustration. It's okay if your instinct is to be defensive. That's normal. All I'm asking is that you don't let that frustration and defensiveness be your only reaction. When you feel that way, let yourself feel it, and then start asking questions about what you just saw. One of the reasons this is so hard to practice, though, is because it requires trusting writers. It requires understanding that media is made through conscious choices and that those choices have been made in good faith. But it can often feel hard to trust writers because we have so much non-conscientious art out there. We've been burned one too many times by art that promises to be deep or interesting and then falls apart at the slightest analysis or is just maddeningly transparent. And that's not even considering the rise of AI-generated images and writing, which are, by definition, made without intention. So if you want to build up what Johnson calls a kind of implicit trust, a tolerance for planned ambiguity, then you need to start slowing down and asking yourself questions. Like, if a writer keeps using a specific color in a certain way, like, I don't know, if an important scene is set in a room with blue curtains, it might be worth considering why that decision was made. Of all the things the writer could have described, they chose to describe the curtains. And of all the colors they could have used, they used blue. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that worth at least just thinking about? And yes, sometimes the reason behind a certain decision isn't super deep, especially for films where budget can be a huge constraint. Sometimes decisions are made because they're cheap, not because of some deeper artistic meaning. And this also isn't to say that authorial intent is the most important thing in analysis either. Contrary to what some people on Twitter believe, you can be pro-media literacy and pro-death of the author at the same time just fine. Because while it's important to consider authorial intent, especially for nonfiction media, sometimes there's enough evidence in the text to make an argument that the author didn't even think about.
Sometimes it's not even intentional. Sometimes people are getting a message across, like they're delivering a message in their work that is more representative of like what they think and what their ideals are. And they may not think that that's like what they're doing when they create that piece of work, but that is like what ends up coming through.
It's like with Tolkien. Tolkien states that he hates allegory. There are clear allegorical elements in The Lord of the Rings. So regardless of him saying he hates it, you can find those elements in there. That's why folks can bring their own meaning and extricate that from the text, even when the author didn't intend for it to happen.
But this is also somewhat related to one of the most common misunderstandings about media literacy. The idea that media analysis is just a matter of opinion. Believe it or not, there is a difference between analysis, which is aided by good media literacy, and opinion, which is just vibes. When you're talking about what a piece of media means, that is analysis. When you're talking about whether a piece of media is enjoyable or not, that's an opinion. The textbook, The Media and Me, A Guide to Critical Media Literacy for Young People, explains it this way. When we adopt a critical stance toward media, we ask questions about meaning, which is open to multiple interpretations, including competing interpretations. This situation might be enough to make you throw up your hands in despair and say, who cares? It's all just a matter of opinion in the end. This is when validity and a host of principles that can help give us confidence that a statement or story is true come to the rescue. Some differences of interpretation are a matter of opinion, but many differences of interpretation can be resolved by considering the evidence for and against each of the competing interpretations. The idea that the validity of different interpretations of a work comes down to evidence is actually the underlying foundation of literary analysis. That's what my high school AP English teacher told us over and over. You can argue anything you want about a text. You can take any meaning you want from it as long as you have the evidence to back it up. There are some interpretations that have more evidence than others, and those are usually the ones that English teachers like to say are the correct interpretations. It's like how we have scientific theories that we might not be able to technically call facts, but for which there is so much evidence that, for all intents and purposes, they can be taken as facts. The meaning of the green light in The Great Gatsby is just like gravity. Sure, it's technically just a theory, but the evidence is overwhelming, and trying to argue that it's just an opinion is going to make you look deeply unserious. But when it comes to your own personal experience with art, you're allowed to have whatever opinions you want. You're allowed. I'm an English teacher, and I am telling you, you are allowed to have feelings about a book or a movie or a video essay, even if those feelings aren't backed up by evidence. You are allowed to feel things about art, and those feelings are valid.
The big question that you should have when you think about art and media and things like that is it's there to make you feel things. Explore that. Go for it. Like, films are not logic dispensing machines of information. They're meant to be forms of art, of entertainment, of joy, love, and all these emotions.
One of the best things we can do is to allow ourselves to develop like personal relationships with art, even that go against the consensus or that just have nothing to do with the consensus. I think one of the best things for me was just like realizing that I have a capacity to understand things, it's already there, and it is not something that needs to be drilled into me so much as something that I just need to like respect and give space. That results in me personally making a lot of connections that other people would consider like a stretch, but it's fine because these are my thoughts to have, my feelings to have, and like a richness of perspectives on art is the whole thing of it. Like if there's only one correct takeaway from a given thing, then what are we doing here? What's even the point of paying attention if you can just like get it all from a Cliff's Notes?
Sometimes this character is wearing a purple shirt just because I wanted them to be wearing a purple shirt. It's not that deep. But like, here's the thing though. If you can take something from that, I don't think that's a bad thing. It might not be what I intended, but that does not devalue what you're getting out of it, right? Like, just because it was not intentional does not mean that it is a bad interpretation to have, I don't think.
I know that I dedicated a whole bit to talking about the importance of intentionality and trusting that art is made with intention. But if what matters most to you is your experience with a piece of art, don't let anyone take that away from you. But honestly, all the advice I just gave is pretty milquetoast, right? To quote an actual academic media literacy article, if the issue were so simple, we could stop writing here and move on to continue advocating for the implementation of these criteria through various educational programs. Yet the situation is far from simple. The situation is far from simple. And something that's important to keep in mind is that one of the main reasons I wanted to make a video about media literacy was because of how it personally affected me as a creator. I felt like a lot of the negative comments I got on my videos were from people with poor media literacy skills who just didn't get what I was saying. And to some extent, I still think that's true. I do believe that, generally speaking, people on the internet could do a much better job of being thoughtful and critical consumers. And I think that all of the advice I just gave is valuable, and we should all try to be more conscientious when we interact with media online. All the people I interviewed also wanted to see better media literacy on the internet, especially in their creative spaces. And clearly we know what good media literacy looks like, so how do we make it happen? Well, my interviewees had a lot of ideas. Jose, Emily, and Scott suggested essentially tricking people into learning by making media literacy fun on its own or hiding it in pop culture analysis. Star and Alex had a similar point, but leaned into the idea that people most readily change their minds based on personal relationships and empathy. They suggested that the best way forward was to talk about media literacy in patient, personable ways. And Noah, Emily, and Babilla suggested modeling the types of behaviors we want to see from our viewers. All of these suggestions are really helpful, and I think most essayists do some form of them already to mixed results. For instance, there's one creator who I won't name who made a video about media literacy and didn't put any of their sources in the description, and I noticed that there were no comments that mentioned that. So like, this creator was talking about media literacy, telling people how to be more literate, including telling them to check sources, but they didn't put their sources in the description. And like, there were even people in the comments who were talking a big game about how media literate they are and how they check sources for everything that they watch, except for that video, I guess. Anyway, All of that is to say that modeling good media literacy is hard. For me, I personally believe that media literacy has a lot to do with intellectual humility and keeping an open mind. And so for me, practicing my own media literacy, I often go into discussions fully prepared to be wrong about things. And while that's sometimes a good perspective to have, it's one that can easily go off the rails. For example, it's probably not a good perspective to have if you are a content creator who gets hundreds and hundreds of comments telling you that you're wrong, all for slightly different reasons, because then you might find yourself questioning every single word you've ever written or every single opinion you've had, and even just like the most basic things that you might even have like a graduate degree in. Hypothetically, of course. I try to be intellectually humble, to see my worldview as open to improvement from new evidence in the experience of others, as Lynch puts it. But historically, that has not gone well for me. But luckily, I'm not alone in that. Almost every other creator I talked to also tended to internalize comments and second-guess themselves.
When I receive comments that are like, you did a really bad job with this, that, and the other, I'm like, oh my god, you're right, I did. Even if it's not true, I tend to have to like run them by my best friend and be like, what do you think? Unfortunately, your comments hurt me. And I will be like, oh my god, they're right, I am literally Satan.
Or if someone's arguing something in the comments, even if especially if it's something that I actually did explain in the video, and I'll be like, I definitely talked about this in the video. It'll be a lot of like, oh man, I guess I should have worded it better. I should have formatted the structure of the video better. So yeah, I will just think like, oh, well, I should have done better, and I'll try to do better next time. And then that just adds up over time.
But what do you do about that? If media literacy is about considering evidence and acknowledging that you could be wrong, how can you honestly do that as a content creator without sacrificing your mental health or integrity? Well, Lynch argues that having intellectual humility doesn't mean you lack an ego. You just don't put your ego before truth. To be open to learning from others, you need to be confident enough to realize what you know and what you don't. Intellectual humility is not an opponent of conviction. You don't need to thoughtfully reconsider your views about racism when talking to the white supremacists on your doorstep. And one reason you don't has to do with the core meaning of intellectual humility. It means, in part, being open to the evidence supplied by the experience and testimony of others. But evidence here is key. Just because someone comes up to you and says the earth is flat doesn't mean you have to take that statement seriously. You can be intellectually humble without, to paraphrase a well-known expression, being so open-minded that your brain just falls out. So, how do I do that? How do I thread that needle? How do I know which comments I should listen to and which I should ignore? Well, there were several good pieces of advice that the others shared with me. Jose and Star both said that they take the volume or frequency of comments into account. If you have just one really angry comment, then whatever they're upset about is probably a them thing, but if there are several comments all talking about a particular point in your work, then maybe that's something you should think about. But as part of this job, you also have to learn how to put up with reading the most terrible things that people think about you. That's just part of this. And like Lola said during our conversation, that can really take a toll on you.
I actually feel like I have really thick skin because you have to in order to do this job and not lose your mind. Because every day on the internet, people are like threatening to kill, rape me. They're, commenting on my appearance. They're commenting on the way I speak. And it's especially hard, I'll say it, like if you're a woman, and if you're not like the most conventionally attractive, people in your comment section tend to be split down the middle of like, yes, mommy, ooh, woo, which is disgusting. Lots of sexualization. I've just dealt with tons and tons of weird sexualization my entire career, which is painful in its own way. But it's also better than so much better than people being like, I think you're ugly, and therefore I'm going to kill you.
Yep. Yeah, I get a lot of like, why doesn't your husband beat you more? which is great. You love to see it. But why do people leave comments? And not just the terrible ones, but in general. Honestly, what is the comment section even for? No one really knows. Star, Emily, Nick, and Alex suggested that people leave comments because they just want to be seen and heard. It's not so much that people want attention, though for some, especially the more inflammatory comments, that is probably the case. It's more of a parasocial or community building thing. Others, like Babilla, Elliot, and Noah, argue that it's more about strong emotional reactions. People comment because they get riled up for one reason or another. Would it be like too meta to, at this point in the video, do like a call to action to leave a comment? Maybe not. Yeah, leave a comment telling me why you leave comments. Like, do you only answer questions that creators give? Is it one of these reasons that I've just talked about? I don't know. Maybe that is, I should have formally in the script said, like, do a call to action here, but foresight is not my strong suit. But maybe, as Alex pointed out to me, focusing on comments is actually just missing the point. I feel like people don't engage with YouTube videos as something that is made with intent. And I think that if people did engage better in those ways, that they would be more media literate and also leave better YouTube comments. I don't know if there was a question in there.
I'm going to disagree with you.
Oh no, okay. No, it's fine, it's good.
Because, you know, I come from a perspective of don't trust the YouTuber.
Yeah.
Okay, that's clearly my own. So what that individual is doing is trying to think critically and potentially making a comment not for you.
I see.
Because we as YouTubers have a tendency to be so focused on the channel being us that comments we feel are directed to us. And even those that call us out directly are not necessarily directed to us. So to assume their intent, I think, is folly. We have created a location surrounding a specific topic, the town square, where people are electronically sharing ideas. Some of those are not directed towards us. So when a person points those things out, it doesn't mean you, Zoe, made a mistake in forgetting these things. It is an individual who may be trying to provide the context to someone else.
So what you're telling me is that I need to work on my media literacy and how I engage with comments, and maybe I should be thinking more about how comments themselves are also, as a piece of media in this world, made with intent and rhetorical choices.
Yes.
I don't like that answer. It makes me mad because it means that that my righteous indignation about YouTube comments is perhaps misplaced. But it is a good answer nonetheless, one that I will have to think about.
Sorry?
Also, he has a great video all about this specific question of trusting content creators on his channel, Legal Kimchi, which I will have linked in the description. It is amazing, and I definitely recommend watching it when this is over. But this idea that I was missing the point, that I was getting something wrong about my position as a creator and my relationship to the comments, it stuck with me. I could not stop thinking about it. I chewed on that conversation for a solid 2 weeks. And that's when it hit me. Remember, media literacy isn't just about how to be a good consumer of media. It's also about how to be a good creator of media. So maybe the problem isn't with viewers, or at least not just with viewers. Maybe I, and all the people I talk to for this video, am more responsible for this than I first thought. This revelation was frustrating. I was so sure that people misinterpreting my videos or misunderstanding my arguments was just a miscommunication. And if I just taught people how to be more critical viewers, and if I did a better job crafting my arguments and modeling good media literacy, then everyone would end up in agreement, and it would be a wonderful little space with only positive comments and thoughtful discussion. But that just isn't how it works.
There's always going to be what you put out there and what people come to the table with. We also must accept that everyone is human. And sometimes the complementary item to what we put out there, what these folks bring to the table, isn't there to meet us. You know, you're always, no matter how well you write something, going to have someone who looks at it, sees the title and thumbnail, watches 20 seconds of it, and then hallucinates an argument into it, gets really mad at you, and leaves a scathing comment. And I posited to you the last time we talked about this, that this was perhaps a type of media literacy in and of itself. But I think learning to accept that people will always do that, and that that's okay, and that maybe it feels a little bleak and like negative on human nature, but that it's kind of undeniable. I think that's like a skill to learn. And I think it's okay to not be perfect at that all the time, and that it's kind of a goal to strive towards, is like learning to, make sure that you're making a quality product, and maybe providing resources to people so that they can try and come to the table and understand it with you, and really try and get at that shared meaning, really try and exist in the world together. But sometimes it won't be possible, and learning to accept that is, I think, important to not stressing about those people. Ultimately, some amount of people are always going to disagree with you. You can't make everyone like you, because if everyone likes you, then you've probably said nothing. That's like, I think, true of just like being a human,
So maybe the real media literacy issue was on my end. Maybe as a creator, I need to have the media literacy to understand that it's literally impossible to create something perfect that no one could ever misinterpret. Even the best writers with the greatest, most thoughtful fans won't reach everyone. There will always be people who just don't get it. And that's a fact of life. And it's a fact that I actually really struggle with, even now, even after doing all of this reading and having all of these conversations. And honestly, maybe that means that this video is useless. I mean, I've spent all this time trying to craft the perfect media literacy video that teaches everyone all these skills and does a full comprehensive breakdown of just how complicated it all is. And maybe it's a fruitless endeavor. Maybe video essays as a genre are just a waste of time. Because if you can't change people's minds, then what's even the point? But then I talked to my friend Star. And Star, the Starfish Face, creator of the webcomic Cast-Off, of which I am the #1 fan, she told me something that I think every single artist needs to hear.
And so, like, everybody comes at a piece of media from their own experience, equipped with their own knowledge, past experiences, and how much they are willing to connect with it. And you cannot account for every single one of those people when you make something. All you can hope is that it hits the right target audience, and that the people who are finding it and are enjoying it are getting something out of it. Because like I said earlier, I was really struggling back when my audience first got really big, that people were not reading the story the way I had intended. They were not interpreting the characters the way that I interpret them as their creator. I had this almost legitimate crisis of like, this story is being taken away from me, and that's very hard. It's like death of the author, but I'm still working on it. It was something that I was really, really struggling with. And I remember I went to a talk given by another comic artist, and something she said really stuck with me. It was something along the lines of, all you can hope is that this piece of media is the thing that someone needs at this exact moment. You think back to like all the shows, all the books that came to you at just the right moment and said exactly what you needed them to say. The only thing you can hope is that that is something that your work is that for someone. You as the creator cannot control how people react to the things that you make. And if they interpret it differently than you intended, who cares? right? Like it's not a reflection on you. It's a reflection on them more than anything. And just try not to take it personally and create something that's meaningful to you. And with any luck, it'll be meaningful to other people who really need it in the moment. And that's all we can hope for, right?